What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Just out on a test drive in a vehicle that I wanted to tell you a little story about. So this is a 96 Ranger. It's a 2.3 liter, what is that, 4-cylinder? Yep. And it's had issues for a long time. I would say upwards of a year, maybe a year and a half, or even 2 years. And kind of the main issue it's had is that the battery goes dead. So the customer will come in, I'll test the battery tests good. At the time of testing, it's charging okay in the upper 13s, 14 volt range. Alternator checks out, and then he'll go home, let it sit for a couple days, and come out and the battery's dead. And so it's been an impossible thing to track down. I've tried a voltage drop test on different fuses and actually put out a video on a parasitic draw that one of the relays had that was sticking closed. So we ended up replacing that, and that seemed to solve things for a while. And he'd be back and forth with it killing batteries and batteries coming back and everything, and being returned, until finally it came in for about the third time with a P0171 Bank 1 system lean code. And so we've been chasing that for the last 2 weeks and trying to figure out what in the world's going on with why the system's lean. And it had a O2 sensor Bank 2, or no, sorry, Bank 1, it's a 4-cylinder. Bank 1, but the downstream sensor was reading solid zeros. And so I started off replacing that and checked it again afterwards, and it was still zeros, so that was really disappointing. So then I chased down the catalytic converter, temperature checked that, back pressure checked that, and that tested okay. So then I started to look at sensor 1 for why it was reading a little bit lean. It should be in kind of the half a volt average range, bouncing between 0.1 or 0.2 and 0.7, 8, or 9. And it was reading less than 0.1 volts at almost all times. So I went ahead and replaced that and tested it again, and it had the same symptoms. So then I started to think, okay, what in the world's going on here? Called a friend on it, and he said what it's probably doing is it's actually running rich, and the O2 sensors are trying to make it run lean, and so it's triggering that Bank 1 lean code. And that made a lot of sense because it is very gassy and smells and had a little bit of a rough idle. And so it was obvious that it was running rich, even though the code was lean. And so what I started to do then is compare my fuel trim numbers with the O2 readings, and they did not match up at all. The fuel trims were in the 25, 30, 35% range, and what I've seen as typical is in maybe the cutting fuel, so negative 5 to 10%, between there and 10 or 15%. It's kind of I don't know what you'd say, arbitrary. But basically seeing that the fuel trim was very, very rich, but the oxygen sensors were very, very lean. And so what I kind of interpreted at that point was that the oxygen sensors were detecting a rich condition and trying to lean it out and tell the computer, this is too rich, we need to lean this out. And the computer was fighting back for whatever reason, we didn't know at that point, with a rich condition. And so I was really stumped. I looked everywhere for why it would be running rich or being commanded rich. Looking for vacuum leaks anywhere, intake leaks, checked the PCV valve hose, all of that, replaced that. Been all over the place trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And so what we did this morning is came in, replaced the PCV valve and the hose, and then I had Jaden take it for a test drive, and I said, check your numbers and compare them to before, and we'll just see if it made any difference, like we had done so many times before looking for any difference in what we were doing. And a couple seconds later, he came back in because the truck would not even make it out of the driveway now. It was so dead. It would idle just awful and spit out smoke and sputter, and it had a flashing check engine light, and all the lights were dinging and beeping and all kinds of crazy things. So what we started to look at, which is what we should have looked at to begin with, or I shouldn't say should have looked at because we did, but should have taken a closer look at, was the voltage issue. And that was that at this point the alternator was only charging 10 or 11 volts, but that was basically the standing voltage of the battery. So essentially the alternator was not working at all, and we were having to jump start this thing regularly to get it to run. And so we went ahead and did the alternator, because I said, if we know something's wrong for sure, and we've confirmed that, we should just replace it instead of continuing to guess. And a lot of that was my fault for thinking we had the right idea, but ignoring the problem that we were sure of, and that was a bad alternator. So I replaced the alternator and checked the voltage afterwards, and immediately we had a couple new symptoms. We were able to start the car, it was able to run and idle smoothly. The battery light on the dash went off, but that's normal because I had unhooked the battery. But with my voltmeter on the battery, it was now charging 14.4 volts and bouncing right in that range. So we were seeing movement with engine RPMs, which is really good, and we were in the 14 volt range, which is also acceptable, and that's good for a new alternator. So I just took it for a drive, and we just got back to the shop. It ran fine, idled well, and did not trigger a check engine light, which it would have done before, within about a half mile of taking it out for a drive. And I just went about 10 miles without a check engine light. So I want to turn you around and show you what our scan tool readings look like now and how those compared to what they were before. Okay, so looking at the scan tool, starting at the top of our PIDs, you can see that the check engine light's off, that's obvious. We are closed loop, which we should be, where before the computer would occasionally trigger this to open to loop fuel system, meaning that it was indicating a fault in the fuel system or something related to that. Even though the engine was warm, we were triggering an open to fuel system. So we've remained closed the whole time. You can see we have a warm engine. We're at 176 degrees. I'm not crazy about these fuel trims still. These are way too high, and they're very similar to what they were before. I'm kind of attributing that to the computer relearning or kind of learning for the first time where it needs to be with the voltage in the correct range. So I'm not going to worry too much about the fuel trims just yet. But what I'm really excited by is if mass airflow looks good. If we go down to our oxygen sensors, like I said, we should see sensor 1 bouncing between about 0.7 or 8 and 0.2. You can see that's exactly what it's doing. It's very responsive, and it's right between 0.2 volts and about 0.7 volts. We would also want to see our downstream O2 sensor 2 there, pretty steady with just a little bit of movement to indicate that it's not stuck or dead, but pretty steady in the 0.7, 8, or 9 range. 0.9 is a little bit lean, or I shouldn't say lean, that's indicating the condition of the catalytic converter, and it's reading a little higher than I'm used to, but that doesn't look too bad at all, right in that 0.9 range. And like I said, the check engine light has not come back on at all, and it's idling much smoother than it did even when it was at its best. There used to be just a little bit of a shake at all times when you were sitting in park or in gear. and the RPMs would drop way down when you put it in gear, but it seems to be much more smooth. So basically the purpose of the video is to say, make sure if you're having a similar issue, or any issue really, with the way your vehicle's running, pay close attention to the problems that you know are there, and keep in mind the importance of voltage. And that's one of the first things that we're taught to check is battery voltage, and kind of along with that, charging voltage of the alternator. So hopefully this video is somewhat helpful to you. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video.